The dust kicked up from Jake's boots settled on the porch planks as he approached the weathered farmhouse, his hat pulled low against the setting sun. 3 months had passed since he'd last ridden through Cedar Creek, but the memory of Eleanor Hartwell had haunted every mile of prairie between here and the Montana border. She stood framed in the doorway now, her auburn hair catching the last golden rays, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Eleanor's hands tightened on the doorframe as she watched the familiar figure dismount. Jake Morrison had always carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew his place in the world, but something had changed. The easy smile that once came so readily seemed forced now, and there was a weight in his shoulders that spoke of too many nights under an empty sky. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, touching the brim of his hat with practiced courtesy. "Eleanor," she corrected gently, as she had the last time he'd passed through. "Coffee's still warm if you're interested." He followed her inside, noting how the house still held traces of her late husband's presence, the pipe on the mantelpiece, the worn leather chair by the window, the family portrait where Thomas Hartwell's stern gaze seemed to follow visitors around the room. But it was Eleanor's touches that made the space feel alive. Wildflowers in mason jars, the scent of fresh bread, the way afternoon light filtered through curtains she'd sewn herself. They sat at the kitchen table, the silence comfortable yet charged with unspoken words. Eleanor poured coffee into chipped ceramic mugs, her movements graceful despite the calluses that marked her as a woman who knew hard work. Jake wrapped his hands around the warm cup and finally looked directly at her. "I heard about the bank," he said quietly. Eleanor's composure slipped for just a moment before she straightened her spine. "News travels fast. Not fast enough, apparently. If I'd known sooner." He let the sentence hang between them. "You'd have what? Ridden in like some night in dusty chaps." There was no mockery in her voice, only a tired resignation that cut deeper than anger would have. "This isn't your battle, Jake." But it was, and they both knew it. Not in any legal sense, he had no claim to her or her troubles. But in the way that mattered to a man who'd spent his life following codes older than law, Eleanor Hartwell had become his responsibility the moment he'd realized he loved her. The realization had come to him 3 months ago, sudden and terrifying as a flash flood. He'd been helping her repair a section of fence that had blown down in a storm, working in companionable silence as they often did when he passed through town. She'd laughed at something, he couldn't even remember what, and the sound had hit him like a physical blow. In that instant, he'd understood why he found excuses to linger in Cedar Creek, why every trail seemed to lead him back to her door. "The Brennan Ranch is offering good wages for the autumn drive," he said now, studying the patterns in the wooden table. "I could stay on through winter if needed." "And then what? Another drive, another season." Eleanor shook her head. "You're a good man, Jake Morrison, but you're not a settling kind of man. We both know that." He looked up sharply. "What if you're wrong?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Eleanor studied his face, searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Jake had the kind of rugged handsomeness that came from sun and wind and honest work, but it was his eyes that had always undone her, gray as storm clouds, deep enough to hold secrets she wasn't sure she was brave enough to learn. "The bank wants their money by month's end," she said finally. $1,500. Might as well be 15,000 for all the chance I have of raising it. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd been tallying figures in his head since he'd heard the news, calculating the worth of everything he owned. His horse, his gear, the small nest egg he'd been saving for a spread of his own someday. It wouldn't be enough. Not nearly enough. "There's the cattle drive to Cheyenne," he said slowly. "Big outfit, good pay. But dangerous." Eleanor frowned. "How dangerous?" "The kind where not all the men come back." She was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup in slow circles on the table. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The sound was lonely and wild, full of yearning for something just out of reach. "I won't have a man risk his life for my mistakes," she said firmly. "They weren't your mistakes. Thomas borrowed that money to buy seed after the drought. You can't blame yourself for what happened after." But Eleanor did blame herself, and Jake could see it in the way she carried herself, the careful distance she maintained even when they worked side by side. She'd been Thomas Hartwell's wife for 7 years before consumption took him, and in the years since his death, she'd thrown herself into keeping the farm running with a determination that was equal parts admirable and heartbreaking. Jake stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening prairie. In the fading light, he could see the outline of Eleanor's vegetable garden, the neat rows she tended with such care. Beyond that lay the wheat fields that should have been their salvation but had fallen victim to an early frost that destroyed half the crop. "I've got some money saved," he said without turning around. "Enough for a start, anyway." "Jake, no. I can't let you. It's not about letting me." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "It's about what's right." Eleanor rose from her chair, moving to stand near him but not quite close enough to touch. "And what gives you the right to decide what's right for me?" The question was fair, and Jake knew it. But knowing something was fair and accepting it were two different things entirely. He'd spent most of his adult life moving from place to place, following the seasons and the work, never staying long enough to put down roots or make promises he might not be able to keep. But Eleanor had changed all that without even trying. "Maybe I don't have the right," he admitted. "Maybe I'm just a drifter who's gotten too comfortable in one place. But I know what I see when I look at you, Eleanor. And I know what I feel when I'm here." She turned away, but not before he caught the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Don't. Please don't make this harder than it already is. It doesn't have to be hard." He stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. "There are other options. The Cheyenne Drive pays triple wages because of the risk, but there's something else. Something that could solve everything." Eleanor faced him again, wariness replacing the tears. "What are you talking about?" Jake took a deep breath, knowing he was about to cross a line he'd never be able to uncross. "Bill Carver runs a high-stakes poker game every month in Denver. Big money. The kind that could pay off your debt and then some. Gambling." Eleanor's voice was sharp with disapproval. "Jake, it's not gambling when you know you can win." His tone was quiet, matter of fact. "I'm good at cards, Eleanor. Better than good. I've just never had a reason to risk that kind of money before." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Eleanor searched his face, seeing something there she'd never noticed before, a hardness, a calculating edge that spoke of a past she'd never asked about and he'd never offered to share. "How good?" she asked quietly. "Good enough." Jake's smile was grim. "I spent 2 years dealing cards in Denver before I took to driving cattle. Learned every trick, every tell. The only reason I stopped was because I didn't like the man it was making me become." Eleanor walked to the mantelpiece, her fingers tracing the smooth wood of the pipe that would never again know her husband's touch. Thomas had been a simple man, honest and straightforward in all his dealings. He would have been horrified at the thought of risking borrowed money on cards, no matter how skilled the player. But Thomas was gone, and the farm that had been his pride was about to be lost to men in suits who cared nothing for the sweat and dreams that had built it. "One game," Jake said behind her. "One night. Win or lose, it ends there." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like snow. When she opened them again, her reflection stared back from the dark window, and for a moment she barely recognized herself. The girl who had married Thomas Hartwell with such hope and certainty seemed like a stranger now. "If you lose?" she asked without turning around. "Then I find another way. The cattle drive, whatever it takes. But I won't let them take your home, Eleanor. I can't." She turned to face him then, and Jake saw something in her expression that made his heart race. Not hope, exactly, but a kind of desperate determination that matched his own. "And if you win?" she asked softly. Jake stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to count the freckles across her nose. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then maybe you'll let me stay long enough to find out if a drifter can learn to be something more." The words settled between them like a promise neither was sure they were ready to make. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust devils dancing across the yard. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the careful control she'd maintained since Thomas's death. "One game," she said finally. Jake nodded, relief flooding through him even as fear tightened its grip on his heart. He'd played high-stakes poker before, but never with stakes this personal. Never with everything that mattered riding on the turn of a card. They stood in the growing darkness, separated by only a few feet but feeling the vast distance that lay ahead of them. Tomorrow Jake would ride for Denver, carrying with him not just his own future but hers as well. It was a weight he'd never carried before, and the responsibility of it was both terrifying and exhilarating. "There's something else," Jake said quietly. "Something I need you to know before I go." Eleanor waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he touched her face gently, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her cheek. "I'd give 10 herds for one night in your arms," he whispered, the words rough with emotion. "But I'd give everything I own for the chance to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life." The confession hung between them like starlight, beautiful and unreachable. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Win or lose, just come back." Jake leaned forward and kissed her forehead, sealing a promise he prayed he'd be able to keep. Tomorrow he would ride into an uncertain future, carrying nothing but skill, luck, and the memory of this moment. But tonight, for just a little while longer, he could pretend that love was enough to change the world.